Hey everyone, I wanted to go over some new and exciting news that we got for Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch. And this has to do with the second half of a developer interview that I went over a couple of weeks back that people were asking me to essentially cover the rest of the interview, which was really detailed specifically in talking about the visuals and the developer decisions as to why the game was essentially rendered in the RE engine. This has become Capcom's de facto engine for basically running every single one of their games visually onto next generation consoles, and the developers for Monster Hunter Rise knew that it would be a little bit of a challenge making it work on the Nintendo Switch, but still went ahead and did so regardless. So in this part of the interview, they go into full detail as to how tough and difficult that process actually was and what the decision making was at the end of the day. So in the very first question, a huge shout out to Nintendo Life for actually doing this interview, they asked what was the main technical reason for utilizing the RE engine for Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch. Yasunori Ichinose, the game's director, replies, "The main technical reason that we use the RE engine's powerful C-hash scripting system, not to mention the latest graphics featuring the RE engine if the hardware specs allow it. In MT framework, all the game logic is implemented by C++, so building time is a process. In the RE engine, the game logic is implemented in C-hash, so building the game can be greatly reduced by approximately 10 seconds, which would take 100 times longer in C++. This allows for quick iterations and trial and error to make the game more interesting. It's not directly visible, but it's a very important part of the development, and I think indirectly it contributes to the fun of the game." And I find this response fascinating for one very quick thing. It's not like they decided to use the RE engine because it visually is impressive or appealing or anything along those lines, or even because, again, like I mentioned at the opening of the video, because next generation consoles are actually using the RE engine for pretty much all of the Capcom games that are being popped out. But it's for the fact that it was just simple, quick iteration, and it makes it good for trial and error, essentially testing out how the game will actually work as they're developing it. So it's fascinating that their first thought process is how to make it easier for themselves to be able to develop the game, instead of actually saying like, hey, we were just trying to like make it as visually appealing or more powerful with better tools that are available, which by default they actually are. But it's one of those things where like they're just trying to make it easier for themselves. The next question is, along with Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, this is a rare instance of the engine being utilized for the Nintendo hardware. To what degree did the core RE engine team adjust the tools to suit the Nintendo Switch? And the developer's response is, RE engine was designed from the beginning with multiple platforms in mind, so the simple porting itself was not all that difficult. However, it was quite difficult to work with the core graphic elements, which involved the Nintendo Switch slightly unique graphics API and MVN to develop a translator for the shade program. In RE Engine, shader programs are written in high-level shader language, but we had to implement a new translator to convert them to OpenGL shading language. In this translator, we implemented a few tricks to output the optimal code while converting from high-level shader language to OpenGL shading language, so that performance of the GPU can be achieved. We also added support specifically to the Nintendo Switch GPU. For example, we added support for adaptive scalable texture compression, a texture compression format that has been very useful in reducing the memory and data size. The very first half of the response actually referencing the ARM architecture. This is something that originally wasn't owned by NVIDIA, but they actually went ahead, I believe they purchased the company that is actually manufacturing the ARM technology. So this is something that now NVIDIA actually handles on their front end. So the developers now have the tools available to be able to essentially just port over games to mobile devices. This is pretty much what that has to do with. The next question I do believe is probably the most technical one that they actually went ahead and asked, and it says, did early testing of the RE engine and the planned visuals of Rise, or was significant optimization required to achieve the performance you wanted? And the response is, the initial performance was quite severe and major optimization was a must. First, we switched the graphics pipeline from a deferred base one to a forward base one. In the past, the RE engine used graphic pipelines based on deferred rendering. However, since the memory bandwidth was expected on the Nintendo Switch, we built new forward rendering graphics pipeline for Monster Hunter Rise. We then made many optimizations one by one from large to small. Examples of these optimizations include baking, applying shadows, applying GPU occlusion culling, and placing depth of field with new lightweight alternatives. Many other miscellaneous optimizations were made as well, including replacing over rigorous computation with simplified computation, replacing compute shader implementations with pixel shader implementations, and adding culling process. We also worked with the artist to adjust the area of influence of lights, since the light sources calculating process becomes very heavy in areas with too many lights. And essentially this response is pretty much just screaming and saying we would have used more RAM if the Nintendo Switch actually had more RAM available to it. That's pretty much all this has to do with. In the very first half of the answer, they pretty much talk about how the memory bandwidth limitations are pretty much the driving factor for them to having to optimize so much of the game and pretty much have to come up with different ways to be able to render it and actually get the AI to be able to work simplistically instead of a more in-depth way. This is why when a lot of people were very critical of like the way the game actually looks and even like compared it to Monster Hunter World, you have to put in context that in Monster Hunter World, the monster skeletons themselves, that's actually referencing to the actual movement of each one of the monsters and the amount of actions that each one of the body parts are able to achieve is like probably from 8 to 9 times fold. So when you're looking at like an Anjanath on Monster Hunter Rise, it's not even like the same type of version of Anjanath that you would have seen in Monster Hunter World. Obviously it looks less rendered, less detailed and all of that. That's by default. But when you actually start looking at its movements and the things that it's actually able to do, it's very much minimalized in the way that it was in Monster Hunter World. It just simply doesn't have that same amount of data to be able to do the same things that it was able to do in that other game. And the last question that they went ahead and asked is, what is your overall feeling after working on Monster Hunter in the RE engine on the Nintendo Switch? The response is, optimization was very difficult, but it was also challenging and rewarding. Thanks to the basic design, tools, and development methods of the RE engine, we were able to challenge the optimization until the very last minute. It was a challenge to fit in the large RE engine into the small Nintendo Switch, but I'm happy that we were able to create something that people will think is impressive and it runs at this quality on the Nintendo Switch. And they're most certainly right about one thing, and that's the fact that the game is impressive regardless of how you try to spin it to be able to get a game looking this good and running this well on the Nintendo Switch that is not a first-party game. And that's probably honestly one of the biggest praises I do think the development team could actually get, is the fact that it's pretty much on par or pretty much right up there, if not succeeding, many of the first party Nintendo games that they've basically been able to put out. Nintendo knows their console well more than anybody else can actually know it. But the fact that Capcom and these developers were actually able to make a product that is pretty much on par with what Nintendo's actually pumping out on this very limited system is appealing nonetheless. And it just opens the door extremely to what that PC version could ultimately end up looking like and playing like, because what they're saying here is that essentially they had to call the game back a whole heck of a lot, and that means that all those options are still readily available for that PC version whenever they have to scale the game back up again to be able to run essentially freely on a PC where there's essentially no limits. The game can just freely do whatever it needs to do, and it's not going to be held back by any sort of, not just visuals, but like memory bandwidths or anything along those lines. So it does seem to be very promising for sure. I don't think it'll still be on that same level of Monster Hunter World, but it can scale extremely well for sure. But that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys found it informational and interesting. I always love to go over these developer interviews, and I thought that going over the second half of the interview that I did pretty much a couple of weeks ago was pretty important, since I didn't want to leave any of that information out. But if you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!